Grace spent her life in the shadows, raising her daughter alone, working 3 jobs and pouring every penny and ounce of love into Emma's future. The backdrop? A lavish beach wedding on Cape Cod, where Grace stood quietly in her thrifted dress, watching the child she once protected now stand beside a man who saw her as a liability. The conflict? A demand for $50,000 as the price to stay in her daughter's life. The consequence? Betrayal so sharp it sliced through decades of sacrifice, leaving Grace no choice but to activate a plan that had been silently forming for months. But what neither Emma nor her polished fiancé knew was that Grace wasn't broken, she was prepared. This is a story of power reclaimed, of calm revenge delivered without a raised voice. And once it begins, you won't look away. So, where are you watching this video from? Drop your location in the comments below. The Cape Cod shoreline shimmered in the golden glow of early evening. Sunlight danced on the soft ripples of the Atlantic, casting gentle waves of warmth across the pristine white chairs set up on the beach. Strings of fairy lights swayed lightly above, fluttering with the sea breeze, suspended between tall poles adorned with peonies and orchids. Everything screamed elegance, an oceanfront wedding curated to perfection. But beneath that flawless surface, something rotten pulsed. Grace stood at the edge of it all, invisible in plain sight. Her pale blue dress, carefully chosen from a discount rack after weeks of saving tip money, clung to her with modest pride. She had straightened her back, adjusted the pearl earrings, fake but elegant, and reminded herself to smile. After all, it was her daughter's big day. She spotted her daughter Emma, glowing in a designer gown that cost more than Grace's yearly rent. Emma was standing next to her soon-to-be husband, Blake Harrington, the heir to a real estate dynasty, handsome, polished, cold. Blake caught her eye, and without missing a beat, he walked toward her, a flute of champagne in one hand and his other tucked into his tailored pocket. "Grace," he said smoothly, handing her the glass as if it were an offering, "I hope you're enjoying the view. Cape Cod really is magical, isn't it?" Grace nodded politely, unsure of what to say. "Now that the formalities are out of the way," Blake continued, lowering his voice just enough to remain civil but cutting, "Emma and I wanted to talk to you about your contribution." "My contribution?" Grace asked, her voice calm but cautious. "Yes," Blake said, still smiling. "You've been welcomed here. We've tried to accommodate the contrast between our lives and yours. But appearances matter, Grace. $50,000 should cover the remainder of the wedding expenses. We consider it a small gesture for continued involvement in Emma's future." Grace blinked slowly. 50,000? Emma appeared then, perfectly timed like everything else at this wedding. Her makeup was flawless, hair cascading in elegant waves. She wrapped her arm around Blake and leaned in. "Mom," Emma said sweetly, but the edge in her voice betrayed her, "you always told me that love requires sacrifice. We've included you today despite concerns. But this isn't a free invitation. Either you support our life or enjoy your time in Arizona. There's a retirement community there we've looked into." Grace's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. The champagne inside trembled, but her hand did not. She felt the blow sharp and clean, but she did not flinch. Instead, she smiled. The kind of smile born from decades of endurance. She lifted the flute slowly, taking a measured sip, letting the silence thicken between them. The ocean behind them roared on, indifferent. Then, with a voice no louder than a whisper, yet piercing enough to make both of them still, Grace said, "You forgot one thing." Blake's brow furrowed. Emma's jaw twitched. Grace didn't clarify. He didn't need to. She watched the first flickers of unease settle in their eyes. She turned away, walking calmly past rows of glittering guests and clinking glasses, past tables where strangers laughed without knowing her name. No one stopped her. She slipped out of the ceremony space as smoothly as if she were stepping out of a dream. As her heels clicked against the wooden path leading away from the beach, Grace didn't look back. Because what Emma and Blake didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that Grace hadn't come unarmed. She hadn't come to beg. She had come prepared. When she reached the far edge of the venue, just beyond the lantern-lit archway, she paused. The music behind her faded beneath the steady rhythm of the waves. She closed her eyes, breathing in the salt air, letting the moment stretch. They had tried to reduce her to a signature, a wallet, a background prop in a life she had built for them. But Grace had one truth they had overlooked. She remembered everything. As the wind brushed across her shoulders and the first stars blinked awake in the twilight sky, Grace's mind drifted, back to a much darker night, to a girl clutching a stuffed rabbit, to blood on her lip and keys clutched in shaking fingers. Back to the moment she stopped being a victim and became a survivor. When Emma and Blake demanded their $50,000 tax on her love, they triggered something far older than they realized. And they would learn soon enough that Grace Foster was not a woman easily erased. When Emma and Blake stared after her, confused by her calm, they had no idea the countdown had already begun. But to understand what Grace meant by, "You forgot one thing," we must first return to the night everything changed, and what she left behind to become unbreakable. And so we go back. It was a different kind of night years ago, far from the polished glow of Cape Cod and the distant hum of a wedding band. The air had been heavy with rain, slamming against the windows of a small, dimly lit apartment in South Boston. A leaky faucet dripped steadily into a rust-stained sink. The television played quietly in the background, though no one was watching. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her lips swollen and bleeding, one eye already bruising, the ache in her cheekbone throbbing with each breath. The silence that followed Tom's outburst was more deafening than the storm outside. He had passed out on the couch, his snores rising and falling in rhythm with the thunder that rolled over the city. In the hallway, barely visible in the flickering light from the kitchen, stood 4-year-old Emma. Her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. Her wide eyes glistened with tears she didn't dare let fall. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But she saw everything. That was the moment. Not the first time Grace had been hit, not the worst injury she had endured. But it was the look in her daughter's eyes that made something inside her fracture in a new, permanent way. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. The beginning of a lesson being written into her child's heart, one that Grace could not allow to finish. With trembling hands, Grace rose. She didn't allow herself to cry. Not yet. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, silent and sure, opening drawers, stuffing only the essentials into a duffel bag. Emma's favorite pajamas, the rabbit, 2 changes of clothes, her documents, and the hollowed-out copy of Pride and Prejudice that hid $237 in cash. That was all she had. She returned to the bedroom, lifted her sleeping daughter into her arms. Emma stirred slightly but didn't wake. "Are we going on an adventure, Mommy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, baby," Grace replied. "The biggest one." And they slipped out into the night, stepping into the rain like fugitives escaping a war zone. They caught the last bus out of the city, riding in silence to the other side of Boston, to a neighborhood Grace had once sworn she'd never return to. But it was where Maggie lived. Her high school friend. The one person who had told her years earlier, "If you ever need out, call me. I don't care when." Maggie didn't ask questions. She took one look at Grace's face, the child asleep in her arms, and opened her door wide. They stayed for 2 weeks. Then Grace found a 1-bedroom rental above a corner store that smelled permanently of cabbage and cigarettes. The kitchen sink leaked and the bathroom light buzzed like a dying fly. But the landlord didn't ask for references, and he accepted the cash she offered without question. For the next 7 years, Grace slept on a pull-out couch in the living room while Emma had the only bedroom. She worked 2 jobs back-to-back, waiting tables at Sonny's Diner during the day, answering phones at Dr. Miller's dental practice at night. On Sundays she cleaned houses in Back Bay for families who never learned her name. She learned how to stretch groceries for a week. She learned how to mend shoes with glue. She learned how to smile through fatigue so deep it ached in her bones. But through it all she protected that little girl and tried to give her the illusion of something safe, something solid. Every small victory Emma achieved. A perfect spelling test, her first full sentence read aloud from a second-hand book. Grace celebrated like it was a miracle. And to her it was. Cupcakes from the corner store became sacred rituals. "You're the smartest girl in the world," Grace whispered into Emma's hair each night. What she never told Emma was how some nights she'd fall asleep still in her diner uniform, shoes still on her feet. She never told her about the pain in her wrists or the bleeding fingertips after cleaning porcelain tubs for women who had never worked a day in their lives. She didn't need thanks. She didn't ask for recognition. She believed, wholeheartedly, that her reward would come later, when Emma stepped into the world equipped with everything Grace never had. But Grace could not have known that all those invisible sacrifices, the long nights, the missed meals, the aching feet, would eventually vanish from her daughter's memory like chalk washed clean from a sidewalk. She could not have predicted that Emma would grow up mistaking survival for shame. But that forgetting didn't happen all at once. It started quietly. A missed phone call. A visit cut short. And later, much later, Emma would look Grace in the eye and see not the woman who saved her, but the woman she had outgrown. And so the distance began. One silent inch at a time. And Grace, unaware of what was growing in the space between them, just kept giving. Because love to her was always about giving. But the next part of this story would force her to learn a far harder truth. That sometimes, loving someone also means knowing when to stop. The Boston skyline shimmered with ambition that night. Downtown glittered with chandeliers behind floor-to-ceiling windows, and inside one of those glamorous venues, Grace stood near the back wall of a grand ballroom. Her dress, plain but pressed, hung modestly on her frame. Her hair was pinned up carefully, silver strands tamed with effort. She held a glass of sparkling water in her hand and tried to focus on Emma, who moved like she belonged there. It was the Boston Chamber of Commerce's annual business gala, and Emma had been invited to speak. She was one of the youngest entrepreneurs on the list, praised for the rapid success of her boutique, Emma's Edit. Grace stood among strangers in tuxedos and silk gowns, watching her daughter float through conversations with the ease of someone born into privilege. Except Emma hadn't been. She had been born into a cramped apartment with leaky ceilings and rationed groceries. But no one here would know that now. Then came Blake Harrington. He appeared beside Grace without warning, introducing himself in that practiced, effortless way the wealthy often did. "David Blake Harrington," he said with a smile, offering a hand. "Harrington Group. Real estate development." Grace took his hand, nodding politely, offering only her first name. His eyes scanned her, calculating. Not unkind but deliberate. "And what do you do, Grace?" he asked. "I'm in the service industry," she replied, vague but truthful. Before he could press further, Emma approached, breathless and radiant, excitement blooming on her face. "There you are, Mom," she said, then turned immediately to Blake. "David, this is my mother. Mom, this is Blake. We've been talking all night." Grace watched it unfold. The two of them were magnetic, undeniably. Emma lit up when he leaned in. He listened with intensity, always 2 steps ahead in the conversation. Within minutes he had Emma laughing, leaning closer, her hand brushing his. Grace saw the shift begin right then, not in Emma's body but in her tone, in the way she responded to him. There was admiration, awe, and something more dangerous, the desire to be accepted. 3 days later, Emma texted Grace that she was going on a date. "With the guy from the gala," she wrote, followed by a string of excited updates over the next 2 weeks. Lunch at the yacht club. A private tour of his family's new development project. Dinner at a restaurant where the valet barely glanced at Grace's used sedan the one time she dared to eat there. Grace said little. She watched. Listened. Observed. Emma's calls became briefer, visits rarer. When they did meet, Emma was different. Less open, less rooted. Blake's name slipped into conversations constantly, always accompanied by phrases like, "he says," or "he thinks." Her opinions started sounding like his. But Grace's first real alarm rang one ordinary afternoon when she stopped by Emma's apartment unannounced. Emma wasn't home. The door had been left ajar, the way it often was when the security code failed to reset. Grace called out but received no response. Inside, the living room was immaculate. New furniture, curated decor, everything polished. She was about to leave when she noticed Emma's laptop sitting open on the kitchen island. She never snooped. Never once. But that day something in her paused. Her eyes drifted toward the screen. A spreadsheet was open. One tab, innocently labeled F_ Planning, caught her attention. She clicked. The document exploded into detail. Mother Management Strategy, it read. Bullet points followed. Color-coded. Keep Grace busy with non-essential vendor tasks. Seat her at a far corner during the reception. Create opportunities for emotional leverage leading to financial contributions. Do not allow open mic moments unless pre-approved. Post-wedding, gradually reduce contact to avoid conflict or guilt. One final note sat at the bottom of the page, highlighted in yellow. Blake's name tagged beside it. Remember the end goal. Full financial support, minimal interference. Grace stood frozen, hand hovering above the mousepad. Her heart beat hard, steady, not with panic, but with clarity. She closed the laptop without making a sound. There was no confrontation. No accusation. Not yet. Instead, she returned home and called two people she hadn't spoken to in months. Maggie answered first, voice warm with the affection only old friends share. "You finally ready?" she asked softly. "Yes," Grace replied. "It's time." Then she called Sarah. Her voice was steadier this time. "I need legal eyes. Now." Because whatever Emma and Blake thought they were planning, Grace had survived worse. And she wasn't going to wait for them to finish writing her out of the picture. No, this time she'd be holding the pen. And she was about to draw a line that neither of them would be able to erase. Sarah's apartment was tucked above a corner bookstore on a quieter street just outside downtown Boston. The windows rattled faintly with the passing of traffic below, but inside it was still. Serious. The kind of quiet that came before impact. Grace sat at the small wooden dining table, hands folded in her lap, shoulders squared, heart no longer heavy, but sharp. Across from her, Sarah flipped through the folder Grace had brought. Legal documents, emails, bank screenshots, and that spreadsheet, printed, highlighted, annotated. Each page a tile in the mosaic of betrayal. "I'm not surprised," Sarah said finally, adjusting her glasses. "But I am furious on your behalf." Grace didn't flinch. "I'm not here for fury. I'm here for structure." Sarah gave a small nod, and from a drawer beneath the table she pulled out a blank legal pad. "You still own 51% of the boutique. It's in the paperwork I drew up when you invested your retirement fund." Grace said nothing. She'd remembered that clause, of course. She just hadn't imagined she'd ever need it. "Right now," Sarah continued, "you're a silent majority owner. That means you have full rights to access financials, initiate audits, suspend operations. If necessary, you can freeze all activity until further legal review. But if you choose to act, Grace, there's no going back. No smoothing things over after." "I'm not looking for reconciliation," Grace replied, her voice even. "I'm looking for truth to matter again." Sarah leaned back. "Then let's get to work." Over the following hours they constructed a plan that was more than revenge. It was a recovery mission. Not for money. Not even for pride. But for dignity, and the memory of every invisible sacrifice Grace had made that was now being reduced to a dollar amount and deleted from a narrative she helped build. They began collecting. Bank statements showed Emma had allowed Blake to access boutique funds. Transfers had been made to shell accounts, traceable to one of Blake's side projects, a development in the South End already flagged for potential zoning violations. Contracts had been signed with investors Grace had never met, let alone approved. Her signature had been forged on at least two. Sarah took meticulous notes. For every document Grace brought, she found a legal counterpoint. For every quiet betrayal, she drew up a response. Maggie arrived halfway through the second day with lunch and support. "I remember when you didn't even know what a wire transfer was," Maggie joked gently, unpacking sandwiches. "Look at you now." Grace smiled faintly. "Turns out surviving poverty is the best business school." They worked late into the evening, days blurring together. Sarah contacted a discreet legal firm she trusted, one that specialized in corporate audits and emergency injunctions. They agreed to remain on standby until Grace gave the word. Nothing would be filed prematurely. Timing was everything. At one point Maggie leaned across the table, eyes curious. "What's the trigger?" Grace looked up. "What do you mean?" "The moment you pull the lever. What's the line they have to cross?" Grace was quiet for a long beat. Then softly, "I'll know when I see it. There'll be no doubt." They left it at that. Sarah prepared sealed envelopes, each one labeled and addressed. Boutique investors. Regulatory agencies. The Harrington family's legal team. All would receive them simultaneously on Grace's cue. Alongside those, she drafted a formal notice of ownership activation. A document that would, once sent, lock Emma and Blake out of the company systems entirely. The power Grace held was quiet but absolute. She didn't want to destroy her daughter's work. That wasn't the goal. But she would no longer allow herself to be erased from it. She had handed Emma a future once, wrapped in scraped knuckles and sleepless nights. That future had now been used as currency against her. That was the line. As she sealed the final envelope, Sarah looked across the table. Last chance to change your mind. I've already changed it once, Grace said calmly. When I gave up my retirement for her. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Then all we do now, she said, is wait. Grace left the apartment that evening with a strange lightness in her chest. Not relief. Not yet. But certainty. She had spent her life patching up holes for others. Now finally she was building something of her own. A boundary. And she would not lift a single finger in anger. She would simply press send. And let the truth do what it does best, resurface. What she didn't yet know was that the moment to strike would arrive sooner than expected. It would arrive in a glass of champagne on a beach, beneath a veil of orchids and cruelty. The sun hung low over the Cape Cod coastline, turning the ocean gold. Guests began to arrive in clusters, heels sinking slightly into the sand, linen suits crisp despite the breeze, laughter floating like bubbles in the salt air. The wedding had the sheen of perfection. Live violinists played near the altar, a drone hovered silently above for aerial footage, and servers in white gloves passed out drinks that cost more than most dinners. Grace stood alone, near a decorative arch wrapped in hydrangeas and silk ribbon. She had arrived early as instructed, but had been left to wander. She wasn't on any schedule. No one had given her cues. Eventually, a coordinator placed her at table 19, back near the caterer's station, far from where the photographers would focus their attention. She smiled politely when addressed, nodded when introduced, though no one ever remembered her name. When the pre-ceremony welcome began, a hostess in stilettos and sequins stepped up to the mic to thank everyone for coming. She listed names: investors, family, friends, mentors. When she arrived at Grace's relation to the bride, her voice faltered for half a second, then skimmed past. No title. No acknowledgement. Just a pause, then applause. Grace didn't react. Later, during the toasts, a guest speaker raised his glass and made a joke about rags to riches, calling Emma a self-made woman, born with humble beginnings but blessed with exceptional drive. He looked toward the Harringtons and smiled, adding, "You must be so proud to have brought her into the family." He did not look at Grace. No one did. But the microphone humiliation came next. A planner approached her discreetly. "Mrs. Foster, the couple asked if you'd like to say a few words. Would you be comfortable giving a brief toast?" Grace hesitated, then nodded once. She rose carefully and made her way to the front. She stood behind the mic and glanced at Emma. Her daughter looked radiant and indifferent. Blake stood at her side, watching Grace as one might watch a scheduled inconvenience. Grace leaned in and began to speak. But nothing came out. The mic had gone dead. He tapped it softly. Nothing. The planner rushed up, whispering something about technical difficulties, apologizing profusely but not offering a fix. Grace stepped back. She wasn't surprised. Not anymore. She returned to her table slowly. At the next moment of pause, Blake approached with Emma in tow. He held 2 glasses of champagne. One he offered to Grace as if nothing had just happened. "A toast," he said with a smug grin. "To family." Emma smiled thinly, her eyes rehearsed. "It's all about support, Mom. You understand." Grace took the glass and held it up. "Of course," she said. Then she took a long sip, calmly letting the taste settle. The bubbles tingled against her lips. She looked from one face to the other. Her daughter, beautiful and hollow. Blake, polished and predatory. Around them, cameras flashed, servers flowed past, and the moment spun like a carousel too pretty to slow down. And then, softly, so soft only they could hear, she said it again. "You forgot one thing." Blake's grin faltered. Emma blinked. Grace didn't elaborate. She set her glass on the nearest tray, turned, and walked off the platform with a grace that defied every slight they had just dealt her. She passed under the string lights, through the crowd, not a single person trying to stop her. It was as though she didn't exist. And that was exactly how they had planned it. She kept walking until she reached the edge of the property, where a small wooden restroom building sat half hidden behind a dune. She didn't go inside. Instead, she pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady. She typed one phrase, "Sandcastle time," and hit send. Moments later, a reply from Sarah appeared. "Understood. Packages delivering now. Legal team on standby. Are you okay?" Grace stared out toward the ocean, the tide coming in slow and powerful. She replied, "I will be." Then she sat on a nearby bench, letting the wind play through her hair, the sound of waves muffling the distant music from the reception. She stayed for 7 minutes. 7 minutes of breathing. Of remembering who she was. Then, just as quietly as she had left, she returned, taking a path that would circle the reception, letting her observe before stepping back into the lights. But this time she wasn't walking back into their stage. She was walking into hers. The curtain had already begun to fall. And no one, especially not Emma or Blake, had any idea what was coming next. The string lights swayed softly above the reception as dusk gave way to night. The violinist had been replaced by a live jazz trio near the dance floor, and servers glided through the crowd with trays of oysters and sparkling wine. The guests buzzed with easy conversation, laughter flowing like the open bar behind them. Everything looked seamless. But then quietly it began. At table 3, where David Harrington, Blake's father, sat with Olivia and 2 business partners, a wedding coordinator in a black headset stepped forward. She held a sealed envelope in both hands. "This was just delivered for you, Mr. Harrington," she said, tone respectful but impersonal. David opened it casually, one hand still resting on his wine glass. He scanned the contents once, then again, slower. His face hardened. Olivia leaned in. A moment later, their business guests turned pale, gripping their own envelopes now arriving at tables across the venue. More coordinators moved discreetly through the crowd, delivering similar documents to a curated list of recipients. Each envelope contained formal notices: notification of a full financial audit of Emma's Edit Boutique, a declaration of ownership activation by Grace Foster, and a temporary freeze on all business activity pending investigation of misappropriated funds. Guests weren't told what was happening, but the sudden tension in the air was unmistakable. David Harrington stood, napkin dropping unnoticed to the ground. He scanned the space quickly, found his son near the bar, and strode toward him with heavy, deliberate steps. He clutched the envelope like a weapon. Grace watched it all unfold from a shadowed walkway near the back of the venue, just out of sight but close enough to see the chaos blooming across the party. She didn't smile. There was no pleasure in it. Only certainty. She stepped forward, slowly re-entering the light. Blake was speaking quickly to his father, clearly on the defensive. His tone was low but urgent. Olivia stood nearby, her mouth tight, her body rigid. Emma stood beside them, confused and tense, her bouquet forgotten on a cocktail table. Then one of the boutique's junior partners, who had been secretly brought on without Grace's knowledge, received his own envelope. He opened it and blanched. Another man did the same, then crossed the floor toward the Harringtons, holding up a document asking for clarity. The cracks were spreading fast. And then one by one phones started buzzing. Not just calls but emails. Notifications from Emma's official business account, pre-scheduled messages crafted by Sarah's legal team, were hitting inboxes across the boutique's network. The messages outlined immediate concerns regarding unauthorized investment dealings, conflicts of interest and missing funds. Emma's phone buzzed too. She glanced down, scrolled through the flood of alerts, and her expression shifted from confusion to dread. Her eyes searched the crowd, landed on Grace. She moved quickly, weaving through guests, lifting the hem of her gown with trembling fingers. She reached her mother, out of breath, panic wide in her eyes. "Mom, what is happening? These messages, everyone's getting them. They're saying something about audits and ownership. Did you do this?" Grace nodded, calm, unwavering. "I'm exercising my rights," she said simply, "as majority owner of the business." Blake reached them seconds later. His mask had cracked completely now. The charm was gone. Only fury remained. "What have you done?" he hissed, leaning close to keep his voice from carrying. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Grace didn't move. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who thought he could erase me from something I built. A daughter who forgot who stood behind her all these years. And a plan, clever but sloppy." Emma grabbed her mother's arm, desperate. "We can fix this. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Blake told me it was temporary, just to generate capital for expansion." Grace pulled her arm free, slowly, deliberately. "You mean the South End property?" she said, voice flat. The one Blake funneled $200,000 of boutique funds into without my approval? Blake's eyes darted toward his father, who was now in a heated conversation with another investor. David Harrington's voice had risen, sharp and cold. People were starting to notice. "You've destroyed everything," Blake snapped under his breath. "No," Grace said, her voice quiet but cutting. "I've preserved what I could. The rest was already rotting. I just let the truth in." Emma's mouth opened but no words came. Her lipstick was smeared now, her face pale beneath the makeup. Around them, clusters of guests were breaking apart into quiet confusion and whispered speculation. The air buzzed, not with music now, but with tension and the realization that the perfect night had collapsed in slow motion. And Grace stood still in the center of it, moving, unashamed. Because when she had whispered, "You forgot one thing earlier that evening," this was what she meant. They had forgotten her. Not as a guest, but as a force. Emma, tears trembling on her lashes, tried again. "Please," she whispered. "Don't do this. Everything we've worked for." "Everything I worked for," Grace corrected. "Everything I gave. Everything you claimed as your own." Blake's phone rang then. So did Emma's. The music faded as the band stopped, sensing the shift. Grace looked at them once more. Then turned. Because now there was nothing left to say. And nothing they could do to stop what was already in motion. The beach was quieter now. The tide had come in high, washing over the footprints that marked the earlier ceremony. In the distance, the reception clung to its last threads. Servers clearing half-eaten plates, guests whispering in tight knots, trying to piece together what had just unfolded. The music had stopped entirely. Grace stood near the shoreline, barefoot now. Her heels dangled from one hand, the other tucked loosely at her side. She watched the waves roll in and recede, each one carving the sand anew. Behind her, hurried footsteps crunched against the gravel path. "Mom, wait." Emma's voice cracked through the stillness. She appeared seconds later, clutching the bottom of her gown to keep from tripping. Her cheeks were streaked with mascara, her arms trembling, the earlier poise and confidence stripped away like stage makeup in the rain. "Please don't leave. We can fix this," she said breathlessly. Grace turned slowly. The ocean wind lifted her hair and carried the scent of salt between them. She looked at her daughter, this woman she had raised, protected, given everything to. And in Emma's eyes, for the first time in years, she saw fear. Not fear of scandal. Not fear of failure. Fear of consequences. "I didn't know what Blake was doing," Emma tried again. "He handled the business side. He said we needed new investors and I thought..." She stopped, wiped at her face. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Grace said softly. "Over and over. Not with one act. But with every time you looked past me, rewrote the story, deleted me from the chapters where I carried you." Emma shook her head, stepping closer. "You don't understand what it's like. I had to prove myself in his world. His family, his expectations, everything felt like it was just out of reach unless I played their game. And I was the liability," Grace said. "It wasn't a question." Emma hesitated, then nodded once, eyes lowering in shame. "I didn't want to be," she whispered. "But yes, that's how they saw you. And I let them. I didn't fight hard enough. I thought if I just kept you out of the spotlight it would be easier, for everyone." Grace inhaled deeply, letting the ocean air fill her lungs. "Do you remember the cupcakes?" she asked suddenly. Emma blinked. "What?" "The ones from the corner store. When you got your first A or read your first book. We'd pick the frosting color together. Blue was your favorite." Emma said nothing. Her shoulders dropped and she looked down at the sand. "I remember," she said eventually. "I used to think that was everything. Just us." "It was," Grace said. "For me." The silence stretched between them. Then Blake appeared behind Emma, his pace slower, his face drawn and hard. The charm had fully evaporated. He looked at Grace with something that was no longer arrogance, something closer to dread. "Whatever you want," he said quickly. "We'll pay you. Triple the 50,000. We'll issue a public apology. Just withdraw the legal actions. Undo the asset freeze." Grace studied him for a long moment. "You still think this is about money?" Blake stepped forward. "Isn't it?" "No," Grace said. "It never was." He opened his mouth to speak again, but a sound near the dunes interrupted him. David Harrington's voice echoed faintly from the reception area, angry, sharp, calling his son's name. Blake flinched. "You think your father is mad now?" Grace asked, her voice low. "Wait until he realizes the boutique funds were used as collateral for a property deal that violates 3 zoning codes. And that you used his name to do it." Blake went pale. He turned and walked quickly back toward the noise, leaving Emma behind. Emma reached out again, her hand landing lightly on Grace's wrist. Her fingers were cold, desperate. "Please. I'm your daughter." Grace didn't pull away immediately. She looked down at the hand, at the diamond ring that sparkled in the moonlight. So expensive, so heavy for a hand that once held a $5 cupcake with joy. "You're my daughter," Grace said softly. "But that doesn't mean I have to let you hurt me." Emma's lips trembled. "Tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix it." Grace met her eyes. "You can't," she said. Emma staggered back as though struck. Her hand fell away. "There's a point," Grace continued, "where sorry isn't enough. Where trust breaks in ways that can't be glued back together. You crossed it. You managed me like a burden. You plotted to phase me out. All I did was believe you." Emma dropped to the sand, the fabric of her gown curling around her like waves. She sobbed, loud, unrestrained, the sound of someone unraveling completely. Grace watched, unmoving. Then, without drama, without bitterness, she turned and walked. She passed the last rows of chairs, the remnants of dinner, the spilled champagne. She passed the band now packing up, the planner in tears by the catering station, guests still unsure whether to stay or leave. She walked until the lights no longer reached her. Until the only sound was the sea and her own breath. She didn't look back. She had done that enough for a lifetime. And ahead of her, someone waited, with the engine running and the road wide open. Sarah's car was parked just beyond the last row of beach grass, headlights off, windows down. The sea breeze moved through the interior, cool and gentle, as if it too welcomed the woman approaching from the darkness. Grace walked barefoot across the packed sand, heels swinging at her side like a pendulum finally at rest. She reached the car without urgency. No one called after her. No one followed. Behind her, the chaos of the wedding unraveled in silence. The reception had fractured, and the noise of it, the arguments, the scrambling, the explanations, faded into nothing more than a distant hum. A memory already dying. Sarah leaned across the console and opened the passenger door. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked. Grace slid in, placing her shoes on the floor gently. "I've never been more ready." For a moment they sat there in the dark. The only sound was the rhythmic sweep of waves and the faint rustle of papers in the back seat. Legal documents, contracts, statements. Grace looked at them, then out toward the horizon. "I'm not angry anymore," she said after a moment. "I thought I would be. But it's something else." Sarah didn't interrupt. "It's grief," Grace continued. "Not just for the daughter I lost tonight, but for the mother I used to be. The one who gave everything, believing it would be enough. It wasn't. And now that I know that, I don't feel empty. I feel clean." Sarah nodded slowly. "So what comes next?" Grace turned to face her, a small, sure smile on her lips. "Oh, small, quiet, right. Somewhere near the coast. Nothing fancy. Just a place where women who've lived full, messy, beautiful lives can find something that reflects that. Not fashion for status, but for strength." Sarah smiled at that. "You'll have a waiting list by month 2. "I don't care if I have 1 customer a week," Grace replied. "I just wanted to be honest. I want to build something that doesn't require me to disappear." Outside, the wind picked up. The first stars broke through the ink-black sky. Sarah turned the key, the engine hummed to life, and the headlights lit the winding road ahead, narrow, unpaved, real. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the wedding venue shrinking behind them until it vanished completely. No glowing tents, no curated centerpieces, no sound system playing someone else's story. Just moonlight on the ocean and a road leading forward. Grace closed her eyes briefly, not to rest but to remember. The night Emma lost her first tooth. The evenings they read side by side. The nights she fell asleep with her shoes still on. She held them gently in her mind, not as wounds anymore but as proof. She had loved. She had given. She had survived. And now she was choosing herself. 3 miles down the coast, they turned off the road and pulled into the gravel driveway of a small bungalow. The porch light flicked on automatically. Grace stepped out, her feet still bare, her soul unburdened. Inside the house, nothing waited. No expectations. No accusations. No one needing her to be smaller, quieter, softer. She stood at the edge of the porch, listening to the waves again, softer now. A lullaby, not a warning. He would start small. A new boutique. A fresh bank account. A schedule that didn't require 3 jobs, 2 bus routes, and 4 hours of sleep. A business built from the ground up. But this time the foundation would not be sacrifice. It would be self-respect. Grace looked up at the stars, then turned and entered the house. Sarah followed, flipping on the lights, setting down the folder of finalized ownership transfers. Not revenge. Not retribution. Closure. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying away the last notes of the wedding music, now distant, fading. Grace didn't look back. She had already given Emma everything she had to give. Now at last it was her turn. And so, beneath the same sky where she once whispered bedtime promises and weathered heartbreak in silence, Grace finally stepped into a life of her own making. Not defined by what she gave away but by what she chose to keep: dignity, peace, and purpose. Her story isn't just one of quiet revenge or poetic justice. It's the story of every woman who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or used, and still found the strength to reclaim her worth. Have you ever reached a moment where walking away was the most powerful thing you could do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if Grace's journey moved you even a little, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us it's never too late to choose yourself.